All right, thank you, Aniota. Thank you to our esteemed speakers that will be introducing each other here momentarily. And I am Larry Edwards. I am your government division, ASQ government division chair. And today we're going to have an excellent and needful presentation. Let's go back one. Go back one. Yeah, that's okay. About building trust, communication, and respect. All three need to be present, and how to thrive in a multi-generational team environment. It's going to be really good about teams. Okay, we can go to the next one. All right. Again, this webinar is brought to you today by ASQ Government Division, one of the 26 divisions of ASQ. We work mightily in the government space and the proxy spaces thereof. Brief overview of ASQ Government Division. We're one of 26 divisions, but ASQ at large, the global organization, has about 80,000 members. And our division, ASQ Government Division, is a community of practitioners, both inside of government, outside of government, parallel to government, that focuses on quality and performance improvement at all levels of government, federal, state, local, and when we have the occasion for international collaboration. So we're comprised of leaders in government, employees, seasoned experts that some of their seasoning might have came from inside of government or parallel to it, consultants, practitioners, university professors or academic students, the whole lot, because government encompasses all of our communities. So we hope that you will join our community. Next slide, please. Okay. In March, it says in March, but in April, we will be doing a replay. It was really good, but we didn't get to record it, on fact-checking journalism and fact-checking to improve information quality, of which there's so much, whether you're talking about AI generation or just our conversations that we've had in social media, print, digital over the years. How do we know what we're looking at is accurate, is true, and has integrity? Well, we'll be doing this webinar in April, coming up, a redo. All right, our next slide. Okay, so during this webinar and any of our webinars, please use the Q&A tab. You should see it, particularly if you're logged in the computer, you should see Q&A tab. Please use the Q&A tab to ask any questions throughout the course of the webinar, the presentation, and we will be kind of grabbing those questions and comments so that we can bring them to our presenters at the towards the end of the meeting. And if you have any questions about ASQ Government Division, feel free to contact us. You can contact me, the chair, at Larry Edwards at memberleader.asq.org, and that information will be at the end of the slide. And then if there's any request for downloads of presentations, we can provide that to you. And we also have a YouTube channel that you can access a lot of this information from the past webinars. But without any further delay, because you're not here for me, you're here for them, I'd like to hand the reins over to one of our two co-presenters, Zach Jarrett, and he's going to take the show from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
And Iota, it's good to see everyone today. We're really excited to be here. And, as Larry had said, we'll be talking about a topic that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about over the years. How do we build trust, communication, and respect, and thrive across different generations and team environments in the workplace, and especially in the public sector? So just to give an overview of our talk today, so Doug and I will each introduce each other. We'll briefly talk about defining what is a generation, because there's a lot of talk. You might have heard people on the radio say, oh, this is a generational person, blah, 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 but provide a clear definition for that. Then we'll look at each generation in the workplace, ranging from the silent generation to Generation Alpha, which is about 100 years worth of generations. Then we'll take a look at how do you manage different generations in the workplace. Doug and I will share some lessons that we've learned along the way throughout our experience. We'll briefly look at some future trends that'll be affecting all the generations we talk about in the next 5 to 10 years. And then we'll share some additional resources and have time for questions. And so I'll pass it off to Doug. He'll start off with briefly introducing me.
Okay, so I've had the pleasure of working with Zach Girard on this. He's the president of Girard Consulting, LLC. He has 20 plus years of experience. Now, he is that old, okay? He has 20 years of experience working with projects and teams, project management, gamification. He's got experience as a tutor for both high school and college students, several different fields. Zach, I know he has a master's in, whatever.
Public
Yeah,
administration.
public administration. There you go. He's a speaker and an author. And his hobbies include, reading and writing and travel and video games. Also, he is a global community supporter. He does a lot of support for multiple professional groups. So I've enjoyed working with Zach. And as you can tell, we're kind of yin and yang on this age thing.
Cool. Well, thank you, Doug. I appreciate that. And so now to introduce Doug, he's the president of DC Wood Consulting. And he has over 40 years of experience in industrial engineering, problem solving, cost of quality, working in quality environments. He holds several certifications, certified in Six Sigma, auditing, quality management. Recently, he got certified as a process analyst, and he does a webinar series on that. And Doug also holds a master's degree in industrial engineering. Outside of his professional life, he's been incredibly active with ASQ. He helps put on webinars with the quality management division. He's done that for several years. He's a speaker, so he'll speak to various sections and divisions. We're both going to WCQI in May, so hopefully we'll get to meet you there in person. And then he's an author of several quality books. And then some of his hobbies, so some stuff he likes to do for fun. He's really passionate about trains. He has a dog. I get to see him occasionally on the camera. And believe it or not, he plays a lot of games, so board games. I've taught Doug how to play Minecraft, and he really enjoys City Skylines as well. Okay, so now that you've learned a little bit about us, we can dive into this topic. And so you might be wondering, well, what is a generation in the first place? Basic definition for it, it's a group of people that are born around approximately the same time. And it could be people born within 20 to 40 years, and in some cases about 15 years or so. And this group of people that are born within a similar time period, they have shared events and traits that have shaped them. And so some of the events, it could be perhaps a war that they've grown up witnessing or perhaps participated in, changes in our economy, technology, social factors, and those are a couple that could influence a generation. And we want to bear in mind that there are some limitations that we want to acknowledge up front when looking at generations. One to keep in mind is that when we talk about a generation, it's a lot of people. So it's tens of millions of people. It's not just like 1 or 2 million, it's 20 million or more. And then as you see this webinar, and as we go through each generation, you might wonder, well, I don't necessarily relate to that one, even though I'm born within that time period. And that's okay, because when we're growing up, there are a whole bunch of different factors that affect us. And it's okay if you don't relate to a given generation. That's no problem with that. And then in no way is this intended to be a stereotype. So as I had mentioned a second ago, we're talking about tens of millions of people. And the way we try to approach this is in a positive light, to look at each generation, to identify areas they're good at, areas they're not so good at, and then opportunities where they could work together or organizations could leverage them in a positive way. And so with that being said, I will pass this off to Doug to start off with the silent generation.
Okay, thank you, Zach. So something I'll mention here is that our research has primarily focused on U.S. generations, United States. The experience of these generations in other countries is likely to be a bit different because they have different events and different economies and things like that. Although that seems to be less true the closer we get to now. Um, Now, the silent generation, these folks were born 1927 and 1945. They're currently in the 70s to 90s range, and so they're sort of getting out of the work environment now. But it's good to think about them because many of them had influence on our culture, on upper management, our board of directors, setting the direction for large organizations. And so understanding them can be helpful to kind of know where we came from. There are, again, 21 million people about in this category. There's some key events that helped shape them. You know, they grew up in the Great Depression, okay, 1930s. And of course, that affected a lot of people. The handful that were extremely wealthy, even they were affected by it. World War II came along, and these people were generally sort of on the young side, and so maybe they didn't necessarily go to war. The Korean War, yeah, many of them did go to the Korean War. But World War II did affect them because it was an entirely different environment to grow up in. Uh, the civil rights movement sort of grew, built up as these people were entering the normal life. And so civil rights was influenced by them. Some of their traits, though, well, let's talk about that. Their strengths, they were hardworking, very determined, and very thrifty. Now, we list some weaknesses here. They're very traditional minded. And I know some people think being traditional minded is an asset. Well, it's sort of a double edged sword. Technology for them, technology was things like, transistor radios. Okay, technology was things like, a phone in every house. Okay, technology for them as they grew up was not the technology we know today. And so perhaps they're not as easily adjusted to this new technology we're facing today. They tended not to speak out. This is why they're nicknamed the silent generation. Be quiet, keep your head down, do your job. That was kind of their mantra. Opportunities that they present in the workplace. They're stable, they're loyal, and they're very resourceful. So these are some of the things that this generation had brought up in our society. Next slide. Okay, baby boomers. So I resemble this remark. I am from this generation. They were born from 1946 to 1964, post World War II. Their current age range is in the 50s to the 70s, and there's a lot of these people, 73 million of them. They're working as experts, and they're in management, and they have specific expertise. Again, they are getting older. Many of them are retiring now, but some of them aren't retiring. They're just transitioning into an expert role. Some of the key events that affected them. The post-World War II economic boom. I mean, the U.S. was just booming. Now, this is where U.S.'s experience is different than other countries, okay? Because in other countries, they had devastation. They did not have an economic boom. They were busy rebuilding cities and societies. The U.S. was the engine of that. Everybody was working. It was an economic boom. People were, making families, and we were building suburbs, and so that changed the way the baby boomers looked at the world. The space race was a thing that happened for this group. The Vietnam War was an event that happened for this group in the U.S. Now, other countries maybe did not see the Vietnam War the same way, but it was definitely an effect on the U.S. The Cold War, again, it affected the U.S. pretty dramatically. Some of the traits of the boomers. Again, they commit to things. They say, I'm going to do this, and then they stick to it. They tend to be team players, work with a team and build that up. And they also kind of enjoy being a mentor, helping other people and being that guidance person. Some of their weaknesses, though, they prefer a structure. If you put a baby boomer in a place where there's no structure, they're going to feel a little lost. They are very competitive. Perhaps that's because there are so many of them and they had to compete all their lives. Um, Again, competition can be good and competition can be bad. They are a little bit they struggle a bit with technology. And again, not as much as the silent generation, and not all of them, but some of them. Okay. So some of the opportunities that the boomers bring to the workplace, again, they are getting older, but they bring a positive reinforcement, a positive point of view. They are very hands-on and they're very task-oriented. One more thing that the boomers did in the US that they did not do in other countries. Baby boomers had children. They had families. Other parts of the world, the families were quite small. And so this affects demographics for, of course, the future generations. So, Zach, take it away.
Um, sure. So after the baby boomers, we had Generation X. They're also known as the new lost generation, and they follow the baby boomers. And so, they were born about the late 1960s to about 1980. And their current age range, so they're 40s to 50s, so they're about mid-career for the most part. And they're a little bit smaller than the boomer generation, and some of the reason why is because of all the events going on around the late 60s and 70s. So you had a lot of economic instability. So you had hyperinflation or stagflation, which we're seeing today to some extent. Um, they grew up in the shadow of the height of the Vietnam War, and then the U.S. leaving that. Also, the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. Um, some of the other key events that affected them. So economic instability. You got to think as Gen X grew up, about every 5 or 6 years there was a recession. The recession of 1982, 1983, crash in 1987, the early 90s a recession, the early 2000s, 2008, and now. So it's like their whole life, they're trying to build up their savings and whatnot, and that gets wiped out. This was the first generation to grow up with having access to a personal computer. So this would be the last one to grow up having to use a typewriter. And then for Gen X, they also saw the end of the Cold War, but then also the Gulf War as well in the early 90s. And some of the key traits that they bring to the workplace, in terms of strengths, they have a really great work ethic. They're also known as latchkey kids, and so they grew up with very little parental supervision, and so they had to parent themselves, but then also become very self-reliant, and that made them very hard workers as a generation. They're really good with being able to set priorities, and so with Gen X, you started to hear some workplaces talk about the idea of work-life balance, where you go to a workplace, you do the stuff you need to, and then you go home, and then you separate the two. Um, they're very respectful as a generation. Some of the weaknesses they have, so kind of like the silent generation, they tend not to be as vocal, so they might be seen as being a little passive at times. They also value efficiency, sometimes over effectiveness. And then money is also a weakness, and that's because of all the economic instability that they've grown up with. And there's a good chance that they'll, continue working beyond what would be traditional retirement. And there are some opportunities that members of Gen X bring to the table. One being that they're very reliable. They're also very consistent. They'll get the stuff done that you need them to. And then they value feedback. So they want to use that as an opportunity to grow or get better at what they're doing. And then we get to millennials. This would be my generation. And, you know, there are some other names they're known as. So after Generation X comes Generation Y. And it's because demographers weren't very creative. They're also known as the trophy generation, because with millennials, they're the first generation where a lot of them got the chance to play on a sports team because their parents tended to be a little bit older. They have more money than parents of past generations. And so they were able to send their kids onto sports teams or academic groups. And on some of these teams, there was this idea that everyone should get a trophy, that it's important to value their kids' self-esteem and their feelings, and that everyone should get a trophy just for participating, even if you didn't win a sports game or whatnot. They're also known as echo boomers. And so for the most part, millennials are the kids of the baby boomers and then some of Generation X. And the time frame they were born in, for the most part, the early 1980s to about the mid 1990s. So currently they're in their late 20s to about early 40s, maybe 42 or 43 this year. And there's about 72 million of them. So they're about the same size as the baby boomer generation. And some of the key events that have affected millennials growing up, they saw a double-edged sword with our economy. So when they were kids, there's a lot of prosperity throughout most of the 80s and then 1990s and about the mid 2000s. But then they also saw layoffs. And so companies changed their philosophy where they went from more of a stakeholder view to a shareholder view and began seeing people as replaceable, partially and due to a lot of process documentation, but then, you know, this erosion in loyalty to an employer or organization. And so employers became less loyal to employees, but then employees also did that too. And with Gen X, so you started to see people that would transition roles within the same industry. And so millennials grew up seeing that. And then when a lot of them were really young or just entered the workplace, the 2008 and 9 recession happened, which held some of them back. They also grew up in the shadow of 9/11, so most of the millennials will remember 9/11. And you know, for most of their lives, the U.S. had been at war in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then millennials are the first generation to grow up with the internet, so having access to all this technology, all this information that generations prior to this didn't have. And then mobile devices. So it's really common. If you go out, you'll probably see millennials playing on a phone or some kind of mobile device. And so Doug and I had thought it'd be better to dive a little deeper into millennial strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, because this is such a big topic for a lot of organizations. They're wondering, how do we recruit these people? How do we retain them? What can they bring to our workplace? And so to start off, looking at some of their strengths, one being they're very independent. If they set out to do a goal or pursue something, you know, they'll go all the way to the ends of the earth to get that done. Another key strength that they have is social responsibility. So for this generation, when they were growing up, their parents told them, you can make a difference in the world. And a lot of them believed it, and they took that with them as they grew up, but then they also brought to the workplace, where they start asking employers, what are you doing to give back to the community? Because without the community, there's no infrastructure or foundation for businesses to exist. And so in the past 20 years or so, you've seen more of a focus on that, on corporate social responsibility, companies volunteering, giving back a percentage of their profits to nonprofits or causes. And they're doing that on purpose to engage millennials. And then another strength they have is they're very flexible. And so growing up with the internet, for this generation, they saw work as more than just 9 to 5. For this generation, it's more about work-life integration. So they, for example, they might work on something in the morning, maybe take a break for an hour or two, come back to it in the afternoon or evening, take another break, and then maybe be up at midnight working on something. Because with technology, it's made it where work is no longer 9 to 5. You could be doing stuff at all parts of the day, including weekends. Now, there are some weaknesses that millennials have that are important to talk about. One being their work ethic. And so growing up with all this technology, with Google searches, is much easier to find stuff than it was in the past. And so they didn't have to work as hard as prior generations did to find information. But then also they grew up where there had been a shift in parenting philosophy, because since there were less kids than there were in prior generations, parents saw kids as valuable and special, and they thought that they should be their kids' friend to some extent, which hadn't happened in prior generations. And so, you know, you had this term called helicopter parents emerge, where parents would kind of shelter their kids from failure or be over involved in their kids' lives. And so, from being sheltered from failure as a kid, they didn't learn how to persist in stuff that maybe Gen X or baby boomers have when they were younger. Another weakness they have is loyalty. And I remember a couple of years ago, someone telling me a statistic that, you know, millennials will switch jobs about every 18 to 24 months. And so imagine, like, if you can keep one of them for 2 years, it's a miracle. And the reason for that change in loyalty goes back to what I was saying earlier, where companies and employees no longer expect loyalty compared to older generations. And then patience is another weakness. Given the speed of technology, millennials tend to want stuff done very quickly or get answers right away. And I think that's something they'll just have to adapt to at the workplace, that, you know, getting stuff done is more than just a Google search or, you know, using technology to fix something very quickly. Now, while I did discuss some of their weaknesses, there are a lot of opportunities to leverage them in the workplace. One being that they have great technical skills. They're really good with technology. Another one is that they're very creative. So having access to all this information, they can go and find information that prior generations couldn't in the workplace, and they can use that to be innovative and come up with new ideas. And then another opportunity is they enjoy learning. So give them professional development opportunities. And I even saw that today. I was on LinkedIn. I saw this article from Forbes, and the title was, you know, if you invest in me, I'll invest in you. And so, you know, for millennials, if employers see that they're willing to invest in them, they'll be more likely to stay and grow within that organization. And so, following millennials, we've got Generation Z. They're also known as the I generation, or centennials, since most of them were born after 2000. For the most part, Generation Z was born on the early end within about the mid 90s, up until about 2009. And some people dispute those dates. They might say 1994 is the cutoff or 2012 on the far end. But for the most part, for most of Generation Z, they're in middle school or high school, or they're in their early 20s. So they're just entering the workplace. And there's about 72 million of them. So they're a similar size as the millennial generation. And some of the key events that they've grown up seeing. So when they were kids, they were living through the 2008 and 9 recession. So they saw their parents get laid off or penalized for being loyal to employers. And then when they go to graduate high school and college, COVID-19 happens. And so there's even more economic disruption that they see right as they're starting their careers. They've seen massive advancements in e-commerce, or digital, economies. They've grown up seeing gun violence talked about all over the news in the US, COVID-19 affecting them, and then technological innovation. So being able to have, voice technology devices, Amazon Alexa. For this generation, they have never known a time without the internet, which has never happened in our human history. And it's crazy to consider, they're the first generation to grow up with that. So since there's a lot of focus now on looking at, early career professionals in Generation Z, Doug and I thought it'd be good to dive a little deeper into their strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. Start off with their strengths, one being they're very adaptive. They're able to pick up skills quickly. They have an agile mindset. You know, throughout their whole lives, they've seen change happen technologically, but also in our society. So that makes them very adaptable to new circumstances. For Generation Z, they're the most diverse generation that we've ever had in our history, in terms of socioeconomic background, cultural background, you know, redefining gender roles, diversity of thought, and that's a huge opportunity at organizations. You know, there have been studies showing that organizations that are more diverse, you know, they're more innovative, they also get more done, they're more effective. And I think especially for government, because with government, there's this idea that you want to have a workforce that reflects the citizens you're serving. And so for Gen Z, that's a huge opportunity to be in the public sector. And then the last major strength they have is they're really good at multitasking. So being that they've grown up most of their lives with a smartphone or technology, they're really good at jumping between tasks. So they might be on an email and then they'll call someone and they'll jump back in their phone and then they'll do something else. For Gen Z, that's normal. Now, there are some weaknesses as well with Gen Z. One being that since this generation spent a lot of time in front of screens and not as much in person, their social skills might be weaker. And they tend to be better in small groups compared to larger groups. And some of that is because they're still developing some of those skills for doing presentations or whatnot. For Gen Z, they tend to take their work very personally. And so sometimes they have a hard time receiving feedback on how to improve from other people. They might perceive that as a threat, that like you're attacking them personally when you're really just trying to help them be more successful in the workplace. And then distractions. So since they're used to multitasking and being on these devices all the time, you know, it's really hard for them to focus. And I think especially, you know, this affects their mental health too, because it's really hard for them to disconnect because they've always been connected to the internet, social media for most of their lives. Now, there are opportunities to leverage them in the workplace. One, similar to millennials, they're really good with technology, and, you know, emerging technology. I saw an article last week about organizations hiring interns to help them with TikTok. So leveraging them for social media is great. You know, they're really pragmatic, very realistic on expectations and where they want to go. And then they have a really strong work ethic. And then we have Generation Alpha, which some of you might not have heard of. They're our youngest generation we have today. You know, and they're still being born. So generally, these are the kids of millennials for the most part, and perhaps some of, you know, the older part of Gen Z. You know, they're still being born. So the cutoff I've seen is about 2010, and then, you know, their generational end in about 2025 or so. And so again, most of them are being born. Perhaps they're in elementary school. Maybe they're just entering middle school. And I've seen a couple of varying estimates on them, you know, ranging from about 35 million to perhaps 50 million of them, which is smaller than millennials, Gen Z, you know, all the generations we've talked about up to this point. And while they're still relatively young and forming generational traits, we can look at some of the key events that are affecting them. So they're growing up in the shadow of all the disruption with COVID-19. The gig economy is normal for them. So going back to a cottage industry that we had pre-industrial revolution, you know, social justice reform. So all the protests we saw about 3 years ago, technological innovation. For Gen Z and particularly Gen Alpha, automation will be a real deal. And for generations prior to that, for decades, we've heard, you know, machines are going to take jobs. Well, for Gen Z and Alpha, that could be a real possibility. And then, you know, with Alpha, they're the first truly globally connected generation because of all these collaboration tools and the internet that we have. And so Doug and I have looked across all the generations we have in the US, working from the silent generation to Gen Alpha. They'll be joining us soon in the workplace. And as we look across generations, you know, we find that they have similar goals, regardless of generation. All of us want to be successful at something or good at something. We want to grow in our skill set. We want to earn certifications, perhaps through ASQ or another group, and grow in our careers. And then we want to make meaningful connections, not just in the workplace, but also with our volunteer groups or perhaps personally. And there's a lot of opportunities, I think, especially for government, looking at our multi-generational workplace. Government provides a great place to work in challenging, complex environments. You can grow into new leadership roles, and then you can add value to the bottom line, not only to customers, but also to citizens, and make a difference in our community. And now I'll pass it off to Doug to talk a little bit about motivation.
Thank you, Zach. So motivation comes up when we're talking about generations, that it always has. Okay. This is a challenge that every single generation has faced. And the older ones usually look at the younger ones and say, what's the matter with them? Okay. Um, First of all, we all know that pay is a dissatisfier. Now, this is the words of Frederick Herzberg's 1959 motivation hygiene theory. Okay. It hadn't been proven wrong yet. Okay. Low pay dissatisfies people, but high pay does not create high motivation. Been shown again and again that pay can only dissatisfy, it cannot satisfy. Okay. So, more recently, some of these ideas have been developed into a concept from Daniel Pink. Maybe you've seen some of Daniel Pink's work on this. The three words on the screen: purpose, autonomy, and mastery appear to be the keys to motivation. It's not just young people either; old people too see this. Pink says these are the drivers of motivation, and they work together to make a framework. And in relation to your experiences, there seems to be a lot to this theory. If you think about this, they interconnect and they help build a better work group. Okay. Under purpose, you need to know the purpose of your work, or you will be unlikely to care about it. Okay. Just sit down, shut up, and do it. That's not really motivating. Under autonomy, you need to make some room to make the job your own. Okay. If you are tightly micromanaged, it will be demotivating. We've all experienced that. And finally, mastery. So, managers need to provide enough resources for people to do the work well, to truly master it. If you feel like you're working with, bear claws and stone axes, okay, you're going to be demotivated. So give people the resources and so on. And this mastery seems to be really important to the older generations, but I don't think it's unimportant for the younger generations either. While each generation does have different values, of course, these three categories can transcend generations, as when you interpret them in terms of that generation's values. So, for example, loyalty was a key value for the silent generation. Okay. For Generation Z, I would suggest that a lack of hypocrisy is a key for that generation. There's probably few things you can do to shut down a Gen Z's motivation than, say one thing and do another. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about some tools. Okay, we're in quality. We know all about tools. And so there are things we can use to reduce the friction with multi-generational work. All right. The affinity diagram, the affinity process, okay, is one way that not only can we brainstorm ideas, but we can organize them for use. This kind of exercise enables people to put their ideas on the wall, and organize them. And because everybody's involved in doing the organization, they feel they have a part in it. And this tends to build trust. Force field analysis. This is another tool in terms of communication that can help. So force field analysis works this way. You put a vertical line on a piece of paper on a whiteboard, and then on one side of it, you put negative phrases, and the other side you put positive phrases. And you start with the negatives, right? I'll give you a couple here. They never listen to us. That's a negative statement, isn't it? You've all heard that. Okay. Well, what is an opposite positive statement? You see, you do this before you roll something out. And so you have all these positive statements ready in your mind. So a positive that might be, repetition is key to people hearing you. So that's a positive statement. Here's another one. We tried that and it didn't work. Okay. Well, here's a positive statement. That was then and this is now. See what that does to your brain? Okay. It kind of reorients your focus. Oh, and one of my favorites. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm sure you've heard that, right? Well, an opposite phrase to that one. Every method can be improved. So this force field analysis, you build these phrases and then you have them in your mind. You have the positive phrases to address the negativity, and you can throw out the positive phrases when you hear the negative ones. The last one, it's kind of a different tool. Stories is a way that you can influence other people. The thing is, all of us learn from stories. We heard stories, and stories when we were children, stories when we were growing up. We read books, we heard things, we saw stories on television and programs. And so these stories build a mental model for us. So if you want to change mental models, you need to tell stories. Nobody's ever changed their mental model from a PowerPoint. I'm sorry, we have a PowerPoint presentation here. But yeah, this isn't going to change your mental model exactly. Hearing a story is more likely to. This can allow the older to connect with the younger associates. But also, the younger associates can tell stories that might help connect to the older ones. Stories about technology, stories about things they've solved. So, again, we go through these different phases in life. When we were born, we adjust to it, and that changes the way we see the world. Each generation needs to work with the other generations to overcome their own weaknesses. So let's go to the next slide. So I'll start and then Zach will finish this one. So older generations, okay, they need to be open-minded. They need to put value on new ideas. They should not discard a new idea just because it's new. Older generations need to think about sustainability. Okay, sustainability means recruiting and retaining younger employees, younger associates. That's important. In some ways, it could be more important than many other things that we value. And third, the older generation needs to be available to mentor young people, mentor people when it's time. Give them space, let them figure out things on their own, but then be there for them to ask questions of that you can answer. So these are some of the things that the older generations can contribute to solving these problems. Zach, what do you have for younger generations?
Cool. Well, thank you, Doug. So looking at some of the younger generations we have and, for improving how they work with older generations, first, it's important to recognize that without the work experience and the time that older generations have put in, we wouldn't be where we are today with our society. You know, like for instance, if you look at the internet, you know, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, you know, they were baby boomers and they helped develop, you know, the technology that millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha take for granted today. And so it's key for younger folks to recognize and respect what older generations bring to the table. And oftentimes they'll be surprised. You know, I've learned a lot of stuff working with Doug. And, you know, you got to imagine for younger generations working with an older person, it's almost like a treasure chest that you find. And as you talk to them, there's a lot they can bring to the table too. Just as older generations put in the time to become experts and master certain areas, it's important for younger folks to do the same and to recognize that mastery is more than just going on YouTube and watching something or doing a Google search, but it's putting in the time, learning skills, getting certified, and the work to get there. But to know that having a mentor can help, so it can help speed up the process a little bit. And then invite collaboration. Instead of just seeing older folks as an obstacle, see them as an opportunity to merge the experience that they have with the new ideas that younger folks have. And by doing that, you create possibilities that are endless, not just for government, but also business and nonprofits as well. And so looking ahead a little bit, there's a lot that's coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And even just looking at the last couple of years since the COVID pandemics happened, we've probably absorbed a decade worth of change already. You know, a couple key trends to highlight. So augmented and virtual reality. You might have seen your kids playing Pokemon Go, maybe Harry Potter on their phone. You know, those will become more common in the future, and especially virtual reality for training applications, but then also for government applications too. And I've seen several games where, you know, virtual reality's been used to teach kids or next generation folks about cities, about solving public problems, um, you know, big data. So being able to have effective data governance, but then also data quality is critical. Artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we've all seen Chat GPT, you know, come in the last few months, and people are asking, well, how's this going to affect us and whatnot? And we have to realize for Gen Alpha, you know, for them it'll be normal interacting with AI and all this technology, even voice technology. So like we might have grown up seeing Star Trek, where you know they'll talk to machines or whatnot, and that's a real possibility as well in the future. And as we reflect on some of these trends, we've got to think, you know, how do we recruit and retain our associates? You know, what will the marketplace look like, or perhaps our communities in the next 5 to 10 years? And then how are we serving a multi-generational customer or perhaps citizen base that we have? And especially with recruitment and retention, not only for younger folks, but also our older generations as well. And so here are some resources that Doug and I had used to put this talk together. You know, again, we're happy to provide those. If you want to follow up with us, I'm happy to send you the links. And I had mentioned a few Forbes articles. I could send you those links as well if you're interested. And here's our contact information. I'll just leave this up for a second so you could have it. But you know, we're both super active in ASQ. You know, we're more than happy to talk with you about this topic or whatnot. And I do want to take a second. I want to thank Doug for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun. You know, I remember almost 2 years ago, we were sitting in a meeting like this, and we were like, well, you know, what's something we could do together? And I told Doug, I was like, well, I've studied generations before, and I was like, it's kind of like a abstract topic. And Doug was like, well, tell me about it. And then I showed him the baby boomer part, and he was like, oh, yeah, that's me. But then he helped me refine a lot of the stuff I do. And, you know, believe it or not, he's incredible to work with. Doug's worked with a lot of government organizations, you know, international expert in cost equality. So highly recommend that you get to know him at some point. We're both going to the World Conference. We're doing a workshop. So if you want to meet us in person, we'd love to. And then I'm also the chair of the Kansas City section. Believe it or not, we're more than just a cow town. We have a lot of government agencies there. And, you know, we'd always be open to collaborating with you on something.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Zach. And I have enjoyed working with Zach so much. It's been a marvelous exercise. It's gotten me working in fields that I probably wouldn't have gone into before, so it's been great. So here we are. Time for questions, I guess, right?
Yes, thank you so much. That was a very insightful presentation. I promise you, I was able to resonate with a lot of the things, even though I cross a couple generations. I encourage anybody that has any questions to either go ahead and put those in the chat for us so that we can go ahead and start the Q&A portion of this. I did have a few questions that kind of started to populate over to me separately.
Okay.
How can we get the younger generation to follow through? That's a little biased.
Well, yeah. Um, we Zach and I talked a bit about attention span and how that's difficult to maintain with these devices all around us. Um, the question of follow through. What do you mean follow through? Does that mean finishing something when it has become obsolete? I don't know, Zach. What do you think?
Well, I think you bring up a great point. I think to build on that a little bit, so, again, thinking about millennials and Gen Z, they grew up in environments where their parents were super involved or perhaps too involved in their lives. And so, their parents help set expectations. This is when I want your chores done. This is when you need to be home. And they bring that mindset to the workplace. And so if managers or associates could follow up and say, hey, I want a response by this date, or I need to know this by then, or maybe break it up into smaller tasks. I need this done by
Mhm.
here, this done by there. Um, that'll help make it more attainable, and then there'll be a higher chance they'll follow through. But if the expectation isn't made about when to follow through, they won't know, and so they might miss it on accident.
I agree with that. I agree with that. All right. Next question. What technology may be used when disseminating information across the different generations?
Hmm.
Okay, Doug, you want me to start with that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I think the COVID pandemic kind of shows a great example of that because you had, pre and post internet generations, and government had to figure out how do we communicate with all of them. And I think in reality, you want to take an inclusive approach. I think for some of the older generations, but also I think younger ones as well, there's a preference for face-to-face communication. So maybe doing like a town hall or whatnot. Um, but I think with the advent of the pandemic and this new world we're trying to navigate, there's a lot of benefits from WebEx or these online communication tools. And so I think trying to do kind of a mix of the two makes sense. And then looking at how you can leverage these different channels. And I think with technology, you can lean on your younger folks. Believe it or not, they've spent a lot of their lives playing video games, being in the virtual world. And so you could lean on them to help develop that communication strategy. Doug, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I think that the different technologies for communication work better in different situations. But sometimes companies and their HR department and their managers, they don't make it clear, okay, what channel should be used where. If you just want to provide an address for somebody, okay, a text message is ideal, okay. On the other hand, if you want to talk to somebody about a dispute in the area where people have become very upset and angry and there's high tension involved, it needs to be done in person. It needs to be done face to face. You can't use text messages and emails to handle that kind of high stress situation. So there's different channels that are useful. The other thing is to remember when you're communicating with somebody, you need to know what they expect. Okay. How did they expect to hear from you? for my children, okay, I don't just call them. All right. I send them a text. I don't know what they're doing. And so I send them a text. Is it you free for a call? And this is a way of being respectful to their time. So
Okay, thank you. Next question. When considering the weaknesses, is it the people in the generation or is it society that creates the traits? For example, a millennial's weakness is loyalty. Traditional mass production philosophy views uh, direct labor as a variable cost. Who would be a loyal to, no, how would who would be a loyal to a philosophy not loyal to them? Who would be loyal to a philosophy
Hmm.
that is not loyal to them? Got it. Okay, I apologize.
yeah. Wow. Can I start this one?
Yeah,
'Cause
go on
you
ahead.
know what? I've definitely lived that. Okay. Um, Growing up, you were taught to be loyal to your company, loyal to your team, and so on. And that was important. And then little by little, um, companies' philosophies changed.
Mhm.
They started going, no, no, we can replace you easily. Perhaps that was because there were so many baby boomers, right? There's always somebody out there with those skills. You can always walk out in the street and hire somebody. There's people on the street corner holding up signs, Will Six Sigma for food. Okay. And there's always that. Well, that means that you don't have to worry so much about losing people. Now, those days are gone. Okay. But the problem is we have policies and practices that have been built into our companies and our organizations today. Everyone goes by them. And some of those policies and practices encourage um, the company doesn't have to be loyal to you. You have to do what we want. Okay. And consequently, what we're seeing now is younger people going, what? you know, what are you telling me? You know, I have 5 job offers. Okay. Why do I need to be loyal to you? And you weren't loyal to my parents. So the point is, loyalty is a two-way street. Okay. If people in HR and company managers can get some idea out of this talk, it is loyalty is a two-way street. And you can't expect it if you don't give it. Furthermore, there's another piece to this. Once lost, loyalty is hard to recover. Okay. Zach?
Well, I think those are all excellent points. I've had some experience too where I've been in organizations and, I felt like I've been loyal for a set period of time and then, I'd leave and no one would care. They would just continue on. And I remember Doug telling me a story about when he left a past employer that, you know, all these people he had known there for a long time that he thought he would stay in touch with. I think only one of them made
Mm-hmm.
an effort to stay in touch with him. And so I think also like our expectations about work are different. I think if we go back to older generations, the silent generation, the greatest generation, so the folks that fought through World War II, the expectation was, you go to high school, you get a job, you work there for 30 or 40 years, and then you get a pension and you retire. And as time has gone on, with people living longer, pensions are more expensive. So those costs have been shifted to the employee. But then also with all of these tools we have, it's much easier to find jobs and then compare salaries and whatnot. And so as loyalties eroded with the employer, it's also happened with the employee. And I agree with Doug. You look at millennials and Gen Z, they have access to all this information. They're watching what companies do. They've seen their parents get laid off, and so they're very cynical and
Mm-hmm.
they can see through if companies are not being authentic or honest.
So it's just business. Okay. It's just business. And we have to adjust to it. It is the way, I hate this phrase, it is what it is. That's the way things are. And it's not anybody's fault. You can't point your finger and say, oh, you're to blame for this. No, it was developed by mass effects over our society. So the society built this situation, and now we have to adjust to it.
Right. And there's still opportunities, even for government. Government jobs tend to be lower paying, but then there are better benefits. And so, as a government organization or nonprofit, you could go to a young person and say, hey, I'll teach you these skills. Can you stay for 4 or 5 years? And so there's still opportunities out there, even though expectations about loyalty have changed.
Yep. All right, we are now at 1 o'clock. We're actually a minute over. So we do have a few extra questions that are in the chat. What I will do is get those questions over to Doug and Zach for them to answer. Once I have those answered, I will provide those out along with today's PowerPoint and today's recording. Again, if you have not already provided me with your information, if you were a call in, if you have logged in digitally, I already have your name and your email address. It was part of Capture when you registered for today's session. However, if you did call in for today's session, please be sure to reach out to me and let me know your information so I can make sure you get your credits for attending today's session. I want to again thank Doug and Zach for taking the time. I think this is a topic that resonates heavily with a lot of individuals because the workforce has been so large and so diverse. We want to make sure that we're not leaving anybody out. So I do appreciate this conversation. Again, I thank you all for taking the time out to join us. If you have any questions for Doug or anyone on the panel, please feel free to go ahead and give us a reach out. Again, if you logged in digitally, I already have your information. This is specifically a need to make sure we have those who called in get their information. I thank you all again, and you all have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.